This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I'd like to move on to our speakers for this afternoon. First of all, we have Alexander Hutton. He's a research fellow at King's College London, working on redressing the past, which is a project about historical pageants. He's just finished his PhD at the University of Cambridge, so many congratulations for that, and is now embarking on this exciting new project. So over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm aware today that almost all of the papers are addressing both public history in the present or in the future, and I'm going to talk about public history in the past. And because of that, I've quite consciously avoided drawing particular parallels between this historical period and the present. I think there are quite a few, and there are perhaps some lessons or morals that we can draw out of this. But I think I'd quite like to leave that to the question and answer session. I think we can probably draw some of these lines out rather than introduce them in this paper just to avoid sounding too preachy. So H.L. Beales is a name that very few people today have heard of. He suffered from what might be referred to as the Acton disease, which used to beset historians who never wrote any books, long before the days of the Research Excellence Framework. Beales's career is what you might expect from a historian who never quite reached his peak. Born in 1889, he studied at the University of Manchester before serving in the First World War. He then went to teach adult education at Sheffield before coming to the London School of Economics in 1926, where he spent the rest of his career. He was turned over for the chair in economic history in 1944, largely because he displeased Tawney, but also because of this conscious lack of publications. The chair went to the rather more creditable economic historian T.S. Ashton, and Beales later retired and famously held a research seminar in the White Horse, the pub round the corner from the LSE, largely despite his colleagues at the school. And aside from a few articles in the 1920s, Beales published nothing that could be considered referable. In fact, I think that Beales was one of the more important British historians, certainly of the Industrial Revolution, if not overall, of the mid-20th century period. And he belongs to something of a lost generation of social historians of the Industrial Revolution between about 1930 and 1960, which is what my recent PhD is focused on. The conventional argument put forth by people like D.C. Coleman and David Cannadine goes something like this. So we have this particular standard of living debate, which I'm sure you've all been taught as an undergraduate, between in the late 1920s, between pessimistic historians about the Industrial Revolution who thought it was sort of an unmitigated catastrophe, and optimists. So between, quite famously, J.L. and Barbara Hammond and J.H. Clapham. Though neither side delivered what could be considered a killing blow, the socialist-inspired historians of the Hammonds, the Webbs, and even someone like R.H. Tawney, and a number of others, went into eclipse as quantified economic history under people like Clapham, T.S. Ashton, and others ruled pretty much supreme until the 1960s, when E.P. Thompson came along with the seminal Make Your English Working Class. And this is obviously a gross oversimplification, but it's going to stand for my paper. Beales himself was in fact, despite his very meagre publication record, an energetic proponent for wider forms of history of the Industrial Revolution. And crucially, Beales was neither an optimist nor a pessimist in the particular sense. He was a socialist but abhorred Marxism. In 1929, he and Richard Lambert, an adult educationist and at that point the head of the BBC's Listener magazine, broadcast a number of talks on the youth of industrialism, in which they both took an adversarial approach over 4 weeks, discussing topics such as living standards, the idea of progress, empire and protectionism. And the programme overall wasn't really about putting across a particular case or an argument, but instead it was showing how all of these particular things, which are set off by the Industrial Revolution, had really come to underpin so much of what we consider, or what they considered to be modern British society. And fascinatingly, listeners were encouraged to discuss these amongst the very short-lived BBC listener discussion groups. And to talk about the issues raised, and then to write in to the BBC. And after the first week, there were 219 responses that thought the Industrial Revolution was a good thing, against only 70 against. Beales went on to be a regular broadcaster for nearly 30 years. His talks aimed at broadening the depth of what could be considered the industrial history or even social history of the 19th century, encompassing topics such as sex, medicine, transport, the history of ideas and a host of others. He was in fact instrumental in spreading the rumour, actually started by Virginia Woolf, that Victorians covered their table legs out of decency. Beales was also a major figure within the adult education movement, and his short study guide on the Industrial Revolution, published in 1928, was notable in its refusal to weigh in on either side of the standard of living debate, but instead sought to present the period as one in which Britain went from a reasonably self-contained rural society built on certain hierarchies into a phenomenally complex one, barely understood by its inhabitants, and from which the contours of modern British society emerged. Despite the overall lack of argument or thesis in the book, it did prove to be a staple on adult education reading lists for the next 35 years or so. And Beales was also an early editor at Pelican Books, which is the non-fiction imprint of Penguin. It's actually just been relaunched in the last few years, which revolutionised the publishing of books in history, sociology, anthropology, you name it. It was through these areas, along with supervising literally hundreds of social historians of the post-war generation, that Beales exerted his massive influence, making a number of other historians he published, including Elie Halevi and his colleagues R.H. Tawney and Eileen Power, both of whom had significant careers outside academia, into widely read historians of subsequent generations. The history of the Industrial Revolution was carried on across this variety of cultural and intellectual networks during this period, at something of a remove from academic history. In some cases, such as with communist historians, this was because getting an academic job was almost impossible. In fact, in 1952, the Times Literary Supplement had advocated expelling all communist or Marxist historians from their posts. Similarly, there were simply not the jobs. In 1949, there were a mere 548 historians teaching in universities. There are about 3,500 now, give or take. And at that time, there were maybe 1,500 to 2,000 people teaching adult education in subjects quite closely allied to the history of the Industrial Revolution. Thus, those who taught and wrote about the history of the Industrial Revolution had to pursue alternative careers in journalism, as school teachers, and particularly as adult education tutors. And it's particularly this hybrid approach within adult education, weaving history, literature, political thought, and economic theory of the period, that I think anticipated or underpinned many of the subsequent developments in the subject throughout the 1960s, and really explain the wider context of particular books such as Thompson's Making the English Working Class or Brain Williams' Culture and Society, books which were very, very appreciative of their immediate social relevance. During the 1930s then, the Communist Party was quite heavily restricted on what meetings and demonstrations it could hold, many of which were broken up by police, fascists or hired louts. In part to get around this, a number of party intellectuals, who mainly wrote for Popular Front journals, such as Left Review or Our Time, which reached something like 10 to 20,000 people, staged a number of pageants or historical reenactments of key scenes from British history. Major pageants were organised in 1936, 1939 and 1948, on several occasions booking out the Albert Hall for prolonged runs to depict a radical story of British history. The crucial thing about this is it wasn't strictly communist. It sort of encapsulated a lot of wider themes, focusing on various social movements. The 1939 pageant, Music and the People, organised by the communist composer Alan Bush and the writer Randall Swinger, featured music by composers such as Ralph Vaughan Williams and Benjamin Britten, was performed by singers including Paul Robeson and Gwyn Parry-Jones. The pageant celebrated a triumphal people's history of Britain, borrowing heavily from A.L. Morton's 1938 book, A People's History of England, published by the Left Book Club, and presented a particular narrative of histories running from the Peasants' Revolt through to the Chartists, and heavily featuring the Industrial Revolution, which ended with songs of international solidarity to reflect the contemporary global crisis. It was this tradition of popular engagement between communist writers, few of whom at that period could be called historians in a strict sense, which went on to inspire the famous Communist Party Historians group, including Eric Hobsbawm, Christopher Hill, Rodney Hilton, and Dorothy and Edward Thompson. Though for much of this history, the Communist Party Historians group in fact lacked this wider audience. There was therefore this constant sense that the Industrial Revolution mattered as a subject because it was very immediate for people, it affected their lives. Arthur Eaglestone began as a clerk and administrator in a coal mine in South Yorkshire in the 1920s, but possessed some literary aspirations. John Milton Murray, who had come to lecture his adult education class, was sufficiently impressed by his discussion to read and subsequently publish his diaries, entitled A Pitman's Notebook, 1925, which Arthur Eaglestone published under the pseudonym Roger Datala. So in South Yorkshire dialect, Datala is sort of short for day toiler or daily paid labourer. His narrative pinpointed this painful reconciliation of his growing intellectual life, reading books by Shaw, Santayana, Henry David Thoreau, and Tolstoy whilst underground, with the unreflexive happiness of a number of his fellow workers, as he said, quite content to live without Debussy or Picasso, lamenting that only 5 or so out of a population of maybe 10,000 had gone to see the plays of John Millington's Synge. Despite this cultural hyperbole, the account contained many memorable scenes, one of which was when Datala, I'm going to use his pseudonym because it's slightly easier to pronounce, recounted seeing a woman crying one day underground because her son had been forced to work night shifts at the local ironworks, meaning that they were unlikely to ever see each other very, very often. This scene recalled to Datala a long tradition from William Cobbett onwards through to the radical historians Jael and Barbara Hammond. And he wrote about their book, "I'm not old enough to remember the advent of the village labourer, but I can quite understand that the effect of it must have been tremendous." He saw in the woman suffering reflected this awful immensity of the unrecorded annals of the labouring poor, those vast unwritten libraries of human experience, as he put it. On the merits of this book, Datala was awarded an adult education scholarship to Oxford University, or as he referred to it in his follow-up, A Pitman Looks at Oxford, the Latin Quarter of Cowley. Datala was introduced through his publisher, John Murray, to the Hammonds themselves, then reeling from the recent attacks on their work. And they made a great impression on him. And at Oxford, Datala was taught by the socialist historian G.D.H. Cole, and he went on to actually turn his thesis into a historical novel that was subsequently turned into a film in the 1930s. Despite the attractions of the literary bohemian world, then clamouring out for proletarian authors, Datala returned to Yorkshire at the height of the Depression and began a long period as an adult education tutor. His third book in the series, Oxford into Coalfield, recounted both the surprising vitality of working class culture and the often dismal apathy he encountered among many of them. He compared a Welshman in one of his classes who had night after night wandered over down the valley 7 miles and back to see the works of Shakespeare performed. But he also recounted this conversation with an old coal miner, and I think it's worth reading out here. I apologise for the accent. "What do you lecture about?" "Industrial history," says Datala. "Socialism?" he questioned darkly. "Industrial history," I corrected firmly. He frowned. "It's all been done before," he asserted. "A lamentable failure." He remembered the last meeting years ago when not more than a dozen people had attended. I suggested that there had been a little development in the world since then, and that there was still great room for more. He dissented grimly. "This place doesn't change, I'm afraid." The man proved to be wrong, and Datala taught classes in the subject in South Yorkshire for the next 30 years. For Datala and his students, many of whom, like him, went on to one of the many adult education colleges where they could briefly step out of this world of manual labour into this educational climate in which they could both improve themselves and come to know more about the world around them. This history was vital to understanding themselves and their place in the world. When the adult education tutor Stella Davies came to write her own autobiography in the early 1960s, it was natural for her that she would write about the generations of her family shaped by Lancashire's industrial history. After attending classes in adult education for many years, Davies had managed to win a scholarship to complete a master's and then a PhD at the University of Manchester in local economic history. Studying the Industrial Revolution and then going on to teach it was the way to understand her people, the generations formed in resistance both to the periodic shift work offered by the factories in the Pennine Valleys and to this climate of nonconformist, free-thinking radicalism that her grandfather and father professed. In literature and religion, they moved from nonconformist to staunch atheists, and in politics, moving from Liberal to Labour. Stella Davies herself was a close friend of Ellen Wilkinson. For her, the subject was far more than this Marxist story or pessimistic story of the wrongs perpetrated on the working classes over history. Rather, it was a story about growth necessary to understand one's place in the present. My talk has been a necessary whistle-stop tour through quite a lot of history, but I hope that I've given a few examples of how this historiography of the Industrial Revolution during this period owed far more to historical outsiders who rarely publish very much and who we tend not to consider all that much today. These poorly paid teachers, writers of often fairly mixed quality, literary critics and budding amateur sociologists, and most of all, the people who attended their classes, who read their work and their newspaper columns, and who performed in their pageants. It's these people, alongside people like Beals, Datala and Davies, and thousands of others, most of whom have passed into relative obscurity, for whom the Industrial Revolution really meant something, if for no other reason than that it was their own story. Thanks.